Thanks, Joe. I always get the easiest gig. So how are we going to change systems? I've got 15 minutes. So I want to start by kind of going back a little bit in my career. So I started doing this work about 20 years ago. And as Joe said, I've been working across the world in lots of different systems, from public healthcare to climate change to malnutrition, all sorts of things. So when I first started this work about 20 years ago, my assumption was that there were plenty of people who were smarter than I am, who got paid a lot more money than I did, older than me, lots more experience than me, and my job was to go to them and basically learn from them how to change systems. And that's what I was going to do. So I was going to get a job, and I was going to learn how to change systems. So my first assignment was working for a consultancy, an organization who essentially did this work of changing systems. And they hired me to write down the theory of what they did. They said, look at what we do, write it down, let's formalize what we're doing. So I spent a year with a notebook, lots of notebooks, and I wrote down everything. So I wrote everything down, and after a year, I went back to my boss, and I said, look, so I've got some good news, I got some bad news. And he said, okay, so what's the good news? So I said, the good news is you have something, basically. You have something here, basically. And he said, what's the bad news? So the bad news is you actually have no idea what you're doing. I said, what do you mean we don't know what we're doing? I said, well, you don't actually know what you're doing, basically. That's part of the problem. And what I basically discovered, if you like, see if these work. Are we getting these up? Yeah. So what I basically discovered was that the dominant paradigm is broken. And that's not news to people here, basically. So we've been talking about this shift from kind of a linear economy to a circular economy. And you could think about the linear economy as the dominant paradigm, if you like. And Carl also talked about revolutions. So historically, we've had revolutions where our paradigms have shifted. We've shifted really how we see things and how we change things. And the way to think about a paradigm is it's a little bit like the ocean that a fish kind of swims in. Typically, it's invisible. So when you talk, this whole thing about telling a fish about water, well, fish doesn't really know what water is. But the thing about water is that in the oceans is that it does determine what a fish can do and not do. So the temperature of the water, the salinity of the water, all of these things determine what's kind of possible. So paradigms determine really what's possible. So if we think about a linear economy, that determines really what's possible. Trying to transition to a circular economy, that changes things. Things become possible. New lifestyles become possible. So here's the thing about paradigms. They're built from practices. Yeah? So what is a practice? I'm going to give you an example of practice. Cooking is a practice. So if you think about cooking, you have lots of different elements to cooking. You have knives and forks, tools, spatulas. You have ingredients that you use to cook with. You have processes, frying, baking, techniques, basically. And you have space. So you have space to cook in. And the thing about a practice is, and cooking is a perfect example, is that you cannot read a book for 2 years, a cookbook, and then basically say to me that I'm now a good cook. I've been studying this textbook for 2 years. I'm going to cook something for you. It's going to be amazing. It's just going to be so good. So typically, the first thing that you cook if you're learning how to cook isn't very good, right? And the only way you're going to get better is if you practice. If you do it again and again and again and again. That's what makes you better. So the question is, what are we practicing? What are all of you kind of practicing? So if you think about the dominant paradigm. So the way I think about the dominant paradigm is it's a two-dimensional paradigm. Two-dimension basically means paper, right? 2 dimensions. So when we respond to complex challenges using the dominant paradigm, there's basically one criteria that we have to meet if our strategies are going to pass muster. And that criteria is that, does it fit into a Microsoft product? Okay? Does it fit into a Word file? Does it fit into an Excel spreadsheet? And now maybe, does it fit on a Google app, basically, right? So the paradigm we work with is two-dimensional. We spend a lot of time analyzing things, and our response to these challenges is primarily technical and analytical. And what we've heard from a lot of the speakers is that that's not sufficient. It's not sufficient to just be technical and analytical. And the way to think about the practice, the dominant practice of responding to complexity, is it's strategic planning, basically. That's what we do, right? So if you walk into work one morning and someone says, look, we've got a challenge. Let's come up with a response to this challenge. And you say, okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to come up with a plan. No one will look at you like you have 2 heads, right? People will go, yes, of course that's what we're going to do. We're going to come up with a plan, And typically, it's going to be a PowerPoint deck. It's going to be 250 pages, and that's a plan, right? And now all we have to do is implement this plan, and it's going to work. And by the way, we're going to use a waterfall approach, project management, phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. It's all good, basically. That's the dominant paradigm, right? Is that familiar to everyone? Yeah? All on the same page? Now, what tends to happen is that changing our paradigms and changing our practices is very difficult. So what we tend to do is we tend to change our technique, and we tend to focus on process or tools. So you hear this a lot in kind of change conversations. What are the tools that you're using? Now, the problem with that is it's a little bit like saying, look, I want to be a good cook, but I'm just going to focus on knives. I'm just going to do knives. I'm going to buy the most expensive knife on the market. It's going to make me a really good cook. Now, of course, we know that's not true. The other way of thinking about it is that when we're process-focused, it's a little bit like saying, look, I'm just going to fry everything, right? Frying's going to work. I'm just going to fry the avocado. I'm going to fry the fruit. Everything's just going to be fried, right? Now, obviously, that doesn't make any sense. If we think about practice, it comprises of a lot more than tools and technique and processes, right? So there are elements that we don't really think about in tangible terms. So what role does love play in cooking? Or care, basically? What role does kind of traditional heritage play in cooking? And if you think about the paradigm of cooking, it's essentially culture, yeah? So in order to be a good cook, it helps to understand culture to some extent, but most of all, what it's about is practice, yeah? Now here's the kicker. So the problem is that we now have to change our paradigm on a timetable. So the science is telling us that we're on a timetable. And that is not up to us. We're not determining it. So historically, these revolutions, Carlotta, that, for example, you've talked about, they happen not because we have, as a consensus, decided we're going to have a revolution. They happen because they're historical events. And historical events happen over time, and they happen at their own pace, and you can't really force them. So if you think about the Copernican revolution, where we suddenly started seeing the world differently, it happened on its own timetable. We didn't decide, let's have a revolution in how we see the world. Let's put a Gantt chart together, and we're going to have phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, and then we're going to be done, right? That's not how it works. So the challenge is we now have a timetable, and the question then becomes, how fast can we change our practices? So the problem with practices is that practice does not live in our heads. Practice lives in our muscles. So if you think about cooking as a practice, it's a physical, embodied activity. It's something that you do, basically. You do it every day, and you get good at it. You stop doing it, you get bad at it. But it's in your muscles, right? And that's true of all practice, basically. So if you think about sports, you think about football, what do people do? They practice to get good at things. And practice then lives in your muscles. And what that means is that when your brain is not functioning because you're tired, exhausted, or you're in fight or flight, your muscles respond to the situation. Your muscles respond in emergency. So if you think about how soldiers are trained when you go to boot camp, what soldiers do, or what soldiers are meant to do, is repetition. So you take a gun and you basically break the gun down, and you do it again and again and again until your muscles remember the actions. And it doesn't matter what your brain thinks. What matters is what your muscles actually remember. And what happens to a soldier is when they go into a battle, their brain is telling them, run, get out of here, yeah? Or fight, basically, but their gun is jammed. So what happens is their muscles take over. And their muscles will break that gun down, and they'll rebuild the gun despite what their brain is telling them. Now, if we think about the situation we're in a bit of a crisis. We're at a bit of an emergency. So imagine that your brain is now disconnected. What practice comes to surface? What do we do in an emergency? What do you do in an emergency? What happens when you go into work? Someone says there's a crisis. What practice takes over? Give you a hint. What do you think it is? Someone? Call it out. What do you do? What do you do in an emergency in the office? You go in and says, I've got a problem. What do you do? Somebody? Anyone? Panic? What do you actually do, though? So the feeling is panic. Oh, shoot, we've got a problem. What are we going to do? What do you do? Call a meeting? Yeah. Send an email? Right? So it's like, oh my gosh, the planet's burning. I better send an email. Right? Oh my gosh, the planet's burning. I better create a 250-page PowerPoint deck. Right? So that's, unfortunately, that's our practice, because we're trained to think rationally. We're trained to think in 2 dimensions. Now, what's needed in terms of our response is 3-dimensional. We need 3-dimensional responses. So, for example, Matthew talked about devolving power. That's a 3-dimensional response. You can't devolve power by writing a PowerPoint deck. You actually have to devolve power in decision making. Now, how do we do that? So if basically our response in this transition from a linear economy to a circular economy depends on you as an organization, you as an individual, learning how to devolve power, how do you do that? How fast can you learn how to do that? How fast can you learn how to actually learn a different decision-making process? How do you do that? So again, the only way of doing it is practicing. So what we really need to do is we need to find approaches, processes, tools, whatever you want to call it, but we need to think about them deliberately as part of a practice, whether that's a practice of deliberation or not. And we basically need to practice, 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 and learn how to do this. Now, it's very, very difficult to do this deliberately. It's very hard because the temptation is that we change our technique. So we switch from frying to baking and we go, let's try baking for a while. Maybe baking will do it. But if you're actually operating in a two-dimensional paradigm, it doesn't really matter what your technique is. What matters is what your practice is. So you cannot change paradigms by just changing the technique. So you can't just say, look, let's just do design thinking now. That's going to change everything, right? Design thinking is an element of practice, which is really critical, but it is one element of practice. It's a process. But the question really is, you know, who's actually doing these processes? Who's doing the actual work? Now, the challenge, I think, really broadly with a two-dimensional paradigm is if I want to stereotype what a two-dimensional paradigm looks like, it's basically neo-Soviet. So what that means is there's a group of people at the top, typically they're white men, typically they're over 40, they make a bunch of decisions. They make a plan, basically, and they send diktats down the chain. So you get your instructions, and your instruction says, okay, you today are going to mine 40 tons of coal. And you look at this, and you go, I don't know how to mine 40 tons of coal. But if I don't do it, what's going to happen? So what's going to happen is you get sent to Siberia, right? So you say, okay, well, I'm going to pretend to mine 40 tons of coal, right, and I'll make up some metrics, and I'll send them up the chain, basically. And as these systems kind of continue, they become divorced from reality. So the numbers say one thing, and reality is doing another thing. And that's the challenge we're really in, which is what is the reality for millions and millions of people? And what do the numbers basically say? They tend to devolve because people tend to game these systems. They tend to lie because you don't want to get sent to Siberia as the consequences get worse and worse and worse. So the challenge we basically have is the paradigm we're in is broken. We need a different paradigm. That means changing our practices. So where I kind of want to leave you with is a question, I guess, which is we've had lots and lots of hints over the last day, basically, and those of you that have just joined us didn't hear some of this, but I'm going to take an example. So Laura from H&M said that we use prototyping a lot in our work. So we prototype and test our products, right? And one of the things she said was, you know, what we've learned is that we have to prototype with a lot of people. So we can't just prototype with one organization or two organizations, but we have to prototype with our value chain with lots and lots of different people. Now, if you think about the team that you actually work in, so think about the team. I'm guessing most of you work in some form of team, right? Or you have colleagues at least. Now, think about how many people in that team come from a different organization or a different sector. Anyone? And I mean team, I don't mean your network. I don't mean like you go and talk to someone in government or you talk to someone who's not in your sector. How many people in your actual team on a day-to-day basis, how many people that you practice with actually come from a different sector or a different sphere of work to you? It's not very common, basically. What's common is we go for meetings with people who are different from us. At best, we have multidisciplinary teams, right? We have white-collar diversity. So you're an economist, I'm an anthropologist. We all know how to use Post-it notes. We all know how to use flip charts, right? So we can work together, right? That's typically what diversity looks like. It does not look like people from different stratas of society, different organizations working together as a team, practicing together. Now, what I'm trying to say is that if we don't learn how to practice together, then we will not change these paradigms. And not only that we need to practice together, we need to practice together at pace in order to learn and develop an entirely new set of muscles in order to make this transition. I'm going to leave you there. Thank you.